Hey there, horror lovers. Welcome back to the channel where the shadows whisper and the unknown lurks just beyond the light. Tonight, we're diving into a tale that will send chills down your spine. An abandoned asylum, forgotten by time but not by the souls trapped within. Are you ready to uncover the horrifying truth of the ghosts of the forgotten patients? Buckle up, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into the darkness. But be warned, once you enter, there may be no way out. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment below, and of course subscribe if you haven't already. Your support keeps this channel alive and helps us bring more terrifying stories to life. And if you love horror as much as we do, share this video with your fellow thrill seekers. Let's spread the fear together. At the edge of town, far beyond the reach of streetlights and the noise of everyday life, stood a building that time had nearly erased. Blackwood Asylum, a place once meant to heal, now only a decaying shell of its former self. A century ago, this asylum had been a beacon for the lost, a sanctuary for those deemed unfit for society. Doctors arrived with promises of salvation, but behind its stone walls, a different story unfolded. Patients were subjected to unspeakable horrors, lobotomies performed without anesthesia, electroshock therapy pushed to the brink of death, and isolation in pitch-black rooms for months on end. Many never left. They did not heal. They vanished, swallowed by the institution itself. Their bodies might still lie beneath the rotting floorboards, their screams forever echoing through the abandoned corridors. Now the asylum stood empty, or so the world believed. James took a deep breath, standing before the rusted iron gate. He knew this was a terrible idea, but it was his job. As a rising YouTube paranormal investigator, he sought out places like this. Haunted ruins, whispered legends, places where fear still lived. Tonight, he would explore the infamous Blackwood Asylum, a site avoided by locals and rumored to be cursed. The night air was bitterly cold, far more than it should have been. He pulled his jacket tighter, his fingers numb as he powered on his camera. "All right," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "This is it. Blackwood Asylum. Abandoned for decades, haunted by those who never left. I'm here alone tonight, and we're going to see if the stories are true." He reached for the gate, pushing against the rusted iron bars. They groaned in protest, a sound like bones cracking under pressure. Stepping inside, he felt the atmosphere change instantly. The pathway to the main building was overgrown with weeds and littered with dead leaves. In the distance, an owl hooted, a lonely sound that only deepened the eerie silence. He lifted his gaze to the asylum. The massive structure loomed over him, its shattered windows gaping like hollow eyes. The moonlight cast long shadows across the crumbling facade, illuminating the graffiti scrawled across the walls. Among the chaotic tags, one phrase stood out. "They never left." A shiver crawled down his spine. Somehow the words felt more like a warning than vandalism. After a moment of hesitation, James climbed the front steps. The wooden boards groaned beneath his weight, brittle with age. He reached for the heavy door and pushed. It resisted for a second before swinging open with a drawn-out creak, revealing absolute darkness. The moment he stepped inside, the air thickened. The temperature plummeted. A foul stench hit him. Mold, damp wood, and something stronger, something rancid. It was the unmistakable scent of rot. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a reception desk covered in a thick layer of dust. Behind it, rows of rusting file cabinets stood like forgotten sentinels. He took a cautious step forward, his boots echoing unnaturally loud in the empty space. Then something caught his eye. An old patient registry lay open on the desk, its brittle pages yellowed with time. James frowned. The asylum had been abandoned for decades. There was no reason for this book to be open, as if someone had just been reading it. His flashlight hovered over the names scrawled across the page, rows of patients long forgotten. Some names had been violently scratched out in red ink. Below the list, a message had been hastily scribbled in shaky handwriting. "We are still here." A sharp breath left his lips. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air pressing against his skin. Something was very wrong. James forced himself to move, pushing deeper into the asylum's decaying halls. The walls were covered in strange stains, dark handprints smeared along the peeling paint, signs of desperate struggles from a past long buried. Then the noise came. Bang. James froze. The sound had come from up ahead, from one of the rooms lining the corridor. He lifted his camera, trying to steady his breathing. Hello? His voice echoed back at him, empty and alone. No response. He crept forward, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. A rusted hospital gurney stood in the middle of the hall, its wheels caked in years of grime. Then it moved. Not by much, just a slight shift. But there was no wind, no vibration, nothing that could have caused it. A whisper slithered through the air, so faint he barely caught it. Leave? His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the flashlight, knuckles white. Then another sound. This one was different, lower, raspier. It was right next to his ear. They will find you? James spun around, heart pounding. His flashlight beam slashed through the darkness. Nothing. But the feeling remained, an undeniable presence watching him, studying him. His camera screen flickered. Static hissed through his headphones, distorting the audio. He tapped the screen, trying to fix the interference. Then the image stabilized and he saw it. At the far end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of his light, stood a figure. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But he knew it was watching him. A deep, suffocating dread settled in his gut. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Then the figure did. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. James' blood turned to ice. James swallowed hard, his breath shallow. His camera screen continued to flicker, distorting the shadowy figure at the end of the hall. The asylum was deathly silent, except for the sound of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears like a war drum. Then the figure took another step forward. James instinctively stepped back. His foot landed on something brittle, an old medical file, and the sudden crack sent a jolt of panic through his chest. His flashlight wavered. When he looked up again, the figure was gone. His mind raced. Did it move? Did it vanish? He scanned the corridor, every nerve in his body on high alert. The air felt heavier now, as if the very walls of the asylum were closing in. A gust of icy wind rushed past him, though there were no windows open. It carried with it a faint sound, something soft, almost imperceptible. Laughter. A dry, cracked chuckle, as if from lips long deprived of moisture. James spun toward the sound, his flashlight darting across the hallway. At the very end, the door to one of the patient rooms stood ajar, swaying slightly as if someone had just walked through it. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to turn back, to leave. But something else, some dark curiosity, forced him to move forward. James pushed open the door, his flashlight revealing a scene of decay frozen in time. A single hospital bed sat in the center, its mattress torn apart by rodents and time. Rusted shackles dangled from the bed frame, their metal corroded but still strong enough to hold a human body in place. The walls were covered in deep scratch marks as though something had tried desperately to escape. But it was the writing on the walls that made his skin crawl. They watch from the dark. No escape. No escape. No escape. He's coming back. The last line was written over and over again, the handwriting growing more erratic as it covered the length of the wall. Some words were written in a dark reddish-brown substance, too old to be fresh but unmistakably not ink. James lifted his camera, recording everything. Then the room shifted. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but the shadows in the corners moved, curling inward like fingers reaching toward him. The bed creaked. James froze. He hadn't touched it. The shackles rattled as if unseen hands were tugging at them. And then the whisper came. He sees you now. James jerked around, expecting to see someone standing behind him. Nothing. His breath came in short, rapid bursts. He knew he wasn't alone, he could feel it. His flashlight beam swept the room again. That's when he noticed it. An old, cracked mirror hung in the far corner, partially obscured by peeling wallpaper. Its surface was dusty and warped, but his reflection was visible. Or at least it should have been. James stepped closer, gripping his camera tightly. In the dim glow of his flashlight, his reflection began to solidify. He could see himself now, wide eyes, pale face, chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. But then something moved behind him. A shadow shifting just outside the mirror's glass. James spun around. The room was empty. He turned back to the mirror. This time his reflection was gone, replaced by something else. A figure stood where he should have been. Its skin was gray and stretched too tightly over its bones. Its eyes, deep, hollow pits, stared at him with an unnatural hunger. And then it smiled. James staggered back, nearly dropping his flashlight. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The thing in the mirror tilted its head as if studying him. Then it reached out. A skeletal hand pressed against the inside of the glass, fingers twitching. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, distorting the figure's face. Its grin widened. James broke free of his paralysis and bolted out of the room, his boots pounding against the rotting floorboards. The hallway stretched before him longer than he remembered. The door he had entered through was gone, replaced by an endless corridor lined with doors, each slightly open as if inviting him inside. His breath hitched. He turned left, then right. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The asylum was changing. A sound echoed down the corridor. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Getting closer. James turned toward the noise, flashlight trembling in his grip. At the far end of the hall, just barely visible in the darkness, the figure stood. Waiting. Watching. Smiling. James pressed himself against the wall, his pulse hammering. He needed to think, needed to escape. He forced himself to breathe, his mind racing through possibilities. Could he retrace his steps? Find a way out? But the asylum was alive now. It had shifted around him, trapping him in its labyrinth of nightmares. The whispering started again. This time it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Low murmurs overlapping, bleeding into one another. Some desperate, some angry, others filled with laughter that held no joy. He's here. You don't belong. Run, James. His name. They knew his name. A chill slithered down his spine. Then a door creaked open beside him. James turned, flashlight shaking. The room beyond was dark, too dark as if the light itself was being swallowed whole. And from within that darkness, something breathed. A deep, ragged inhale. James took a step back. Then the door slammed shut. A new whisper. You can't leave. James stood frozen, his breath shallow. The asylum had changed around him, its layout warping into something unrecognizable. The door that had slammed shut moments ago was now gone, just a solid, cracked wall in its place. The whispers had stopped, but their absence felt even worse. Silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace. This was something deeper, wrong? James turned, searching for a way out. The corridor stretched endlessly now, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Each door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness waiting beyond. Then something moved. A shadow shifted inside one of the rooms, too fast for him to see clearly, but it was there. James lifted his camera, his fingers trembling. The lens flickered with static as he zoomed in on the open doorway. That's when he saw it. A pale hand, thin and unnatural, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Slowly, another hand appeared. Then a face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, watching him. James took a step back. The figure didn't move. It just stared. Then the other doors began to creak open, one by one, as if something inside each of them was waking up. James turned and ran. His footsteps echoed through the corridor, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. The hallway twisted and turned in impossible ways. He should have reached the entrance by now, but the asylum wouldn't let him go. It stretched, bent, reshaped itself into a nightmare. Then he heard it. A wet, skittering sound. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Something was crawling. James dared a glance over his shoulder, and instantly regretted it. A figure was chasing him, moving on all fours, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Its face was obscured by tangled hair, but he could see its mouth, twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. And it was fast. James pushed himself harder, lungs burning. He turned a corner, another endless hallway, and slammed into a door at full speed. Lock. The skittering grew louder. James fumbled for anything, his flashlight, his camera, his sanity. His fingers found the rusted handle and he yanked it down. The door flew open. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself inside and slammed it shut. Darkness. James held his breath, pressing his ear to the door. Silence. Then a soft knock. A single, deliberate tap against the wood. Then another. Tap, tap. James squeezed his eyes shut. You can't hide. The voice came from inside the room. James spun around, flashlight shaking. The room was small, a former patient's chamber. The walls were lined with deep scratches, nails clawing at the paint, trying to escape. A single bed sat in the corner, rusted shackles still attached to its frame. The mattress had rotted away, exposing moldy stuffing beneath the torn fabric. But it was the desk in the corner that caught James' attention. A dusty notebook lay open, its pages yellowed with age. He hesitated, then stepped forward, carefully flipping through its contents. The handwriting was erratic, growing more unstable with each page. They watch me from the dark. The doctors don't see them, but I do. He told me I can't leave. He told me I belong to him now. He is coming. James swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the fragile paper. The last entry was different. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, and it was written in red. James? His breath hitched. The ink was still wet. James took a step back, his entire body cold with dread. Someone, or something, had written his name in the book. Recently. His flashlight flickered. The shadows in the corners deepened, shifting unnaturally. Then he heard it. A sound like nails dragging against stone. James lifted his gaze. The ceiling above him was cracked, mold creeping through the plaster. But within the fissures, something watched him. A single, bloodshot eye stared down at him from the darkness. Then another. And another. A dozen eyes, all embedded within the ceiling, all watching. The walls groaned, the room tightening around him. The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the ceiling. He sees you now. James bolted for the door. The door flew open and James stumbled back into the hallway. But something had changed. The corridor was longer now, stretching into the distance far beyond what should have been possible. The doors on either side were gone. No windows. No exit. Just an endless path lined with flickering lights. Then at the very end of the hall, something stepped into view. Tall. Motionless. Waiting. It wasn't human. Its limbs were elongated, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. It had no eyes, but James knew it was looking at him. It lifted one hand, long fingers stretching out, beckoning him forward. James turned to run the other way. But the corridor behind him was gone. There was only the path forward. The asylum had made its choice. James had to keep moving. Or let whatever was waiting for him take him first. James had no choice. With the corridor stretching infinitely behind him, and the looming figure ahead, he knew he had to move forward. His legs trembled as he stepped forward, his heartbeat deafening in the silence. The figure remained still. Watching. Waiting. The closer James got, the more unnatural it looked. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, its mouth curled in an expression that was neither a smile nor a frown. Its limbs twitched sporadically as if struggling to remain in place. James clutched his flashlight, keeping it aimed at the figure's face. But as the beam of light hit it, the figure shuddered. And then it moved. Not by walking. Not by running. It snapped forward. One moment standing in the distance, the next only inches away. James barely had time to react before the thing opened its mouth. No sound came out. Instead, darkness spilled from its lips, crawling toward James like living smoke. James turned and ran. The corridor twisted, the walls closing in, shifting like something alive. Every door he passed watched him. Some had peering eyes, others had fingers twitching from the cracks. The asylum wanted him. And it was not going to let him go. James skidded around a corner, and nearly fell. A staircase stretched downward before him, spiraling endlessly into darkness. The walls around it were covered in frantic scribbles. Don't go down. He's waiting. No escape. James hesitated. Behind him, the corridor groaned. The air grew heavier as if something was pressing against his back. Then he heard a sound that turned his blood to ice. A deep, guttural breath. James didn't wait. He ran down the stairs, his flashlight shaking as he descended deeper and deeper. The steps never seemed to end. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The air smelled of mildew, rust, and something foul, something rotten. Then he heard it again, whispering. The voices of the forgotten patients, murmuring in unison. He took us. He'll take you too. You belong to him now. James gritted his teeth, pushing forward. He had to find a way out. Then his foot met empty air. The last step was gone. James tumbled forward, falling into absolute darkness. James hit the ground hard, his camera skidding out of his grip. Pain shot through his ribs, but he barely had time to register it before he realized where he was. A massive underground chamber stretched before him, dimly illuminated by a sickly yellow light. Rusted hospital beds lined the walls, each occupied by something. Figures lay motionless on the beds, skeletal, wrapped in decayed hospital gowns. Their skin was leathery, their mouths open in silent screams. Some had their wrists and ankles shackled to the bed frames. Others had surgical markings carved into their flesh. James felt bile rise in his throat. These were the forgotten patients. And they weren't dead. One of them twitched. Then another. One by one they turned their heads toward James. Their hollow eyes locked onto him. James took a shaky step back, but the floor beneath him shifted. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber. And then from the shadows something crawled forward. It was larger than any human, its body hunched and grotesque. Bones jutted from its skin, its elongated fingers twitching as it moved. But its face, was the worst part. It was stitched together. Pieces of different faces sewn into one grotesque mask, their mouths frozen in silent agony. Eyes that did not belong together blinked independently, staring at James from different angles. It exhaled a wheezing, hungry sound. James couldn't move. The thing reached out, one long hand stretching toward him. You came to us, it rasped, its voice layered with the whispers of countless souls. Now you stay. James turned to run. But the patients on the beds began to rise. Their bones cracked as they moved, their heads tilting unnaturally. They reached for him, their fingers clawing at the air. James was surrounded. James's mind screamed for an escape, but there was none. The walls of the asylum pulsed, the air thick with decay and something alive. The thing that called itself the Master stepped closer, its stitched face stretching into something resembling a grin. You don't leave, it whispered. James felt the darkness press against his skin, wrapping around him like chains. He was being pulled under. His flashlight flickered, and his camera, still lying on the ground, began recording on its own. The lens focused on him. James stared at the screen. His reflection wasn't there. Instead, the Master was staring back at him. And then the light went out. To this day, James's footage remains online. The final frame shows the asylum's empty hallways, silent, untouched, abandoned. But sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear him screaming. And that, my friends, is the terrifying legend of the abandoned asylum. Do you believe the spirits of the forgotten patients still linger, waiting for the next soul to wander into their cursed domain? Or was James simply another victim of his own fear? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new horror tale. And if you dare, share this video with your friends. Let's see who among them is brave enough to watch until the end. Remember, fear is a powerful thing, but courage is even stronger. No matter how dark things may seem, there's always light waiting beyond the shadows. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next nightmare. The next video. Until then, sleep tight, if you can.